In the history of world tennis, few names carry the legendary weight of Bjorn Borg. At the end of the 1970s, he was not just a champion, but an icon of an entire era. With his long blonde hair and familiar white headband, Borg stepped onto the biggest courts in the world with an almost supernatural calm. His achievements came so fast and so brilliantly that the whole world was left in awe. At 18 years old, Borg won his first Grand Slam title at Roland Garros, kicking off a career that would later be etched into tennis history. In his relatively short professional career, he won a total of 11 Grand Slam titles, including 6 French Open championships and 5 consecutive Wimbledon titles from 1976 to 1980, a feat rare in the history of this prestigious tournament. Borg also claimed over 60 ATP titles, held the world #1 ranking for multiple periods, and was the cornerstone of Sweden's Davis Cup team. His legendary matches, especially the 1980 Wimbledon final against John McEnroe, are regarded as one of the greatest tennis matches of all time. To American audiences and fans worldwide, Borg was not just a champion. He was the embodiment of icy perfection, an emotionless warrior emerging from the sacred grass courts of Wimbledon. But behind that dazzling string of victories was a harsh price that very few saw. The coldness that made Borg the Iceman of tennis was actually a protective shell formed from crushing pressure and years of prolonged loneliness. Success came too early, and his youth was nearly swallowed by the relentless tournament schedule, the expectations of an entire nation in Sweden, and the glare of international media lights. While the world celebrated him as a winning machine, Borg quietly battled mental exhaustion that few understood. Each new title brought glory, but also amplified the fear of failure and the pressure to keep winning. His life gradually shrank to stadiums, hotels, and flights, while the sense of isolation grew deeper inside. At just 26 years old, while still at the peak of his career, Borg suddenly quit professional tennis, a decision that stunned the world. It was not the surrender of a weak champion, but the choice of a person who had endured too much pressure in silence. And it was from those invisible wounds that Borg's resilience was forged, turning him not only into a legend of victory, but also a symbol of rare mental endurance in sports history. If the story of Bjorn Borg makes you reflect on the true cost of glory, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this tragic yet deeply inspiring journey. Behind the cold spotlight the world saw on Wimbledon's grass courts, the real story of Bjorn Borg began far from the cheers. It was in the small Swedish town of Södertälje, where long winters blanketed everything in snow and life passed in near total quiet. Borg was born into a family that wasn't poor, but wasn't wealthy either, a family steeped in the discipline typical of Nordic society. His father, Rune Borg, was a stern man who believed success came only through relentless discipline and effort. The love from that father wasn't shown through praise or hugs. It came through immense expectations, sometimes so heavy that a child could hardly comprehend them. From early on, Borg felt he had to prove his worth. But young Bjorn wasn't always the cold figure the world later knew. On the contrary, he was a child with intense emotions, quick-tempered and prone to explosive outbursts when things didn't go his way. On the small tennis courts of the local club, Borg would often throw his racket, yell, and burst into tears after losing. He wanted to win at all costs, but those outbursts worried the adults around him. One day, when Borg was still a little boy, his anger on court went too far. After a tense match, he lost emotional control, reacting fiercely toward the umpire and his opponent. The club management decided to ban him from playing. To a child, it might have just been a punishment. But to Borg, it was a direct blow to the heart. Tennis was the only place he felt he had value, and suddenly that door slammed shut. That moment became a quiet turning point in his life. Borg realized that if he wanted to keep playing tennis, he had to change not his technique, not his fitness, but his emotions. He began teaching himself to stay silent when angry. He learned to swallow tears after defeats. He learned to hide any inner pain from everyone. Gradually, the hot-tempered boy disappeared. In his place emerged a teenager who barely showed emotion. On court, Borg became so quiet that many found it baffling. No excessive celebration in victory. No visible disappointment after mistakes. Just calm eyes and slow steps back to the baseline. Those around him started calling it maturity. But few realized that this composure wasn't inner peace. It was a wall built brick by brick to conceal his true feeling. The boy Björn Borg was learning to lock his heart away, not because he had no emotions left, but because he believed that was the only way to be strong enough to survive in the brutal competitive world of sports. Every match became a lesson in self-control. Every loss became a lesson in silence. And over time, that silence became his trademark. As Borg entered his teenage years, people began noticing something strange. A young face with the calm eyes of a grown man. He no longer yelled. He no longer threw rackets. He no longer showed anger. There was only cold, almost mechanical focus. It was on those small tennis courts in Södertälje that a profound transformation took place. The world would later call him Ice Borg, the Iceman of tennis. But few knew that this coldness wasn't a natural gift. It was born from a hurt child who had been rejected and taught himself to hide his heart, to keep moving forward. And from that moment, Bjorn Borg was no longer just a boy learning to play tennis. He was learning to turn himself into a winning machine. But no one back then understood that the price of that transformation would follow him for the rest of his life. Those silent years on the small tennis courts of Södertälje gradually turned the once hot-tempered boy into an astonishing young player. But no one could have predicted that this change would lead Bjorn Borg down a path far too big for a teenager. At just 15 or 16 years old, Borg's talent began drawing attention across Sweden. His heavy topspin shots, extraordinary endurance, and astonishing emotional control made many coaches believe they were witnessing something truly special. But for Borg, everything happened so fast that even he couldn't fully grasp what was going on. In 1972, at only 16 years old, Borg was called up to Sweden's Davis Cup team. It was a moment many players wait their entire careers for. For Borg, it came while he was still just a boy trying to find his place in the world. When he stepped onto the Davis Cup court for the first time, spectators saw a skinny teenager with long hair and strangely calm eyes. No one saw the tension coiling inside him. No one heard the pounding heart of a boy carrying an entire nation's hopes on his shoulders. But Borg won. And from that moment, the prodigy story began. Swedish media started calling him the future of national tennis. Praise-filled articles appeared more and more. The adults around him talked about him as if he were already a true champion. But Borg was still just a teenager who hadn't had time to grow up. Just 2 years later, in 1974, something the tennis world could hardly believe happened. Borg entered Roland Garros at 18 years old and left Paris with his first Grand Slam trophy. A Swedish teenager had just beaten the world's most experienced players to become champion of the toughest clay court tournament. All of Europe was stunned. Sweden exploded with pride, and international press began talking about Borg as a phenomenon. But success that comes too early often carries a price people only realize years later. When Borg lifted the Roland Garros trophy that year, the world saw a new champion. But inside, Borg was just a young man who hadn't yet figured out life. The schedule grew packed. Constant flights took him from Europe to America and back to other tournaments. Strange hotels became temporary homes. Giant stadiums replaced the small tennis court where he once practiced as a boy. Pressure grew with every win. In Sweden, Borg wasn't just an athlete. He became a national icon. Every loss became big news. Every victory raised expectations higher. The press started following his every move. Commentators spoke of him as a genius who would dominate tennis for years to come. But they forgot one important thing. Bjorn Borg had only just left his teenage years. Fans saw a cold, perfect champion. They saw a face that barely showed emotion in victory. They called him Ice Borg, the Iceman of tennis. But that coldness wasn't maturity. It was a survival mechanism for a boy thrust into a world far too big for him. Every time he stepped onto the court, Borg had to keep playing the champion role everyone expected. No room for fear, no room for weakness, no room for a normal youth. And so, the boy Björn Borg began learning a harsh lesson that many sports legends learn too soon to survive at the top. Sometimes you have to bury parts of your humanity. The world then saw a sports phenomenon rising. But few realized that behind those brilliant victories was a boy growing up too fast, swept into a storm of fame that even adults could barely endure. And that was only the beginning of the journey that made Bjorn Borg a legend. And also the journey that forced him to pay the price for his own greatness. After those years of youth swept into the whirlwind of fame too soon, Bjorn Borg entered the phase that the whole world would later call his era of dominance. By the mid-1970s, Borg was no longer just a prodigy. He became the center of the tennis world. The biggest stadiums from Paris to London grew familiar with the image of the Swedish guy with long blonde hair and the white headband. But nowhere was more deeply tied to Borg's legend than Wimbledon, the sacred grass courts of tennis, where history is written with every serve, seemed born for his cold, precise playing style. In 1976, Borg won his first Wimbledon title. For many players, a win like that would have been the peak of a career. But for Borg, it was just the beginning. In 1977, he returned and won again. Then 1978, then 1979. And when 1980 arrived, Bjorn Borg stood before something very few athletes in history had ever achieved: 5 consecutive Wimbledon championships. British fans began calling him the Ice King of Wimbledon, the Ice King of the Grass. On court, Borg barely showed emotion. When he won a point, he just turned and walked back to the baseline. When he made an error, his face stayed calm. To the millions of American viewers watching the matches on television, Borg seemed like a perfect winning machine, a person unshakable by pressure. But on the other side of the net, the tennis world was changing too. Borg's opponents no longer feared him the way they once did. They began to rise, bringing strong personalities and a hunger to defeat the king. Among them, 2 names became icons of that era: Jimmy Connors and John McEnroe. Connors embodied aggression and fierce competition, always playing with near-explosive energy. But McEnroe was the perfect opposite to Borg. If Borg was ice, McEnroe was fire. He yelled, argued with umpires, and displayed every emotion on court. Those 2 people, those 2 styles, created one of the greatest rivalries in sports history, and it all reached its peak in the 1980 Wimbledon final. That day, center court was packed. The whole world was watching. Borg was chasing his 5th consecutive Wimbledon title. McEnroe was trying to dethrone the king. The match stretched on in suffocating tension. The 4th set became legendary, with an 18-16 tiebreak for McEnroe, one of the most dramatic moments in tennis history. But in the final set, Borg held firm. He won 8-6, claiming his 5th straight Wimbledon title. The entire stadium erupted. Fans stood and applauded non-stop. The press called him a living legend. To the world, it was the pinnacle of greatness. But very few understood what was happening inside that cold figure. Each of Borg's victories didn't just bring fame. It also carried enormous pressure. Every time he stepped onto the court, he wasn't just playing to win. He was playing to defend the invincible image the world had pinned on him. A loss wasn't just losing a match. it could shatter the legend. And so, Borg lived with a fear few could see. The fear that one day he might no longer be the Bjorn Borg the world worshipped. His life back then was like a long hallway of hotels, airports, and courts. Cheers always rang out, but when the lights went off, silence returned. Real friends were rare. A normal life barely existed. And while audiences saw a king on Wimbledon's grass, inside Borg was still the boy who had learned to lock his emotions away to survive. Each victory made the legend bigger, but it also made the armor Borg had to wear heavier every day. And no one back then knew that the very weight of that glory was quietly pulling him closer to a decision that would stun the world just a few years later. The thunderous applause at center court that year seemed to confirm what the whole world believed. Bjorn Borg was at the absolute peak of his career. 5 consecutive Wimbledon titles, 6 Roland Garros titles, dozens of ATP titles, and an almost invincible image had turned him into a global sports icon. The press called him the Ice King of Wimbledon. Fans saw him as a perfect winning machine. Opponents stepped onto the court feeling they were facing a legend. But behind those victories was a truth very few saw. When the stadium lights went out and the crowds left the stands, Bjorn Borg often returned to a completely different world. A world without cheers, without glory, just endless silence. His life gradually became a monotonous and harsh loop. Hotels, tennis courts, flights, from London to Paris, from New York to Monte Carlo, Borg moved constantly, like a man without a home. Strange hotel rooms became where he slept at night. Packed stadiums became the only place he truly existed. And between those worlds were long flights, where he sat alone staring out the airplane window, sometimes without saying a word to anyone. To millions of fans, Borg lived a life they could only dream of. But to him, that life was slowly becoming empty. Real friends were almost non-existent. Normal relationships were hard to form when someone lived constantly under the pressure of competition and media. Even the people closest to him were usually just coaches, managers, or reporters. No normal evenings with friends. No carefree moments of youth. No simple life like others his age. Borg was only in his early 20s back then, but he lived like a man carrying the responsibility of an entire nation. In Sweden, Borg wasn't just an athlete. He was national pride. Every match of his was watched by millions. Every victory was celebrated like a victory for the country. But that very adoration also became a burden. When people believe you are a legend, they also expect you never to fail. And for Borg, that pressure grew bigger every day. Every time he stepped onto the court, he didn't just have to beat his opponent. He had to protect his own invincible image. A small mistake could become a headline. A loss could shock the world. So Borg kept building his emotional armor thicker. He spoke less, showed emotion less, let fewer people see his real self. To audiences, that made him mysterious. But to Borg, it gradually became an invisible cage. On the outside, he was the champion. But inside, he was starting to feel exhausted. The long, consecutive seasons wore down his body and mind. Victories that once brought joy now only brought brief relief. And right after, the pressure for the next win began again. Borg later said there were nights he lay in hotel rooms feeling an inexplicable emptiness. He had money, fame, and the admiration of the world. But he had no sense of peace. Sometimes, looking in the mirror, Borg wondered if he was still the boy Björn who hit balls on the small tennis courts in Södertälje, or if he had become an icon he couldn't escape. In the eyes of the world, it was the most glorious period of Bjorn Borg. But inside him, a different feeling was growing. The feeling that his life had been swept into a machine with no way out. And right at the peak of that glory, a painful truth began to emerge. The peak of his career no longer felt like a dream. It started feeling like a prison, a prison built from fame, expectations, and the victories the whole world demanded he keep achieving. And Bjorn Borg, the king of Wimbledon, began to feel trapped in the very legend he had created. And then, right at the peak of his career, when the world still believed Bjorn Borg would continue to dominate tennis for many more years, an unexpected decision appeared. In 1983, Bjorn Borg announced his retirement. He was only 26 years old. To the tennis world, it was almost an unbelievable shock. A champion at his peak, who had just won 11 Grand Slam titles and conquered Wimbledon 5 times in a row, decided to leave the courts while still young enough to keep winning. American and European press immediately filled with questions. People speculated that Borg would come back. Many believed he just needed a break. But Borg understood something no one else could feel. Inside him, his endurance had run dry. The years of non-stop competition, media pressure, the expectations of an entire nation, and prolonged loneliness had worn him down to the core. When he stepped onto the court, Borg could still win. But each match now required a greater mental effort than ever before. Each victory no longer brought joy, only temporary relief. And right after, the worry about the next match began again. Fans saw an invincible champion. But Borg knew that inside he was slowly crumbling. There were nights in hotel rooms when he lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and wondering how much longer he could keep going. It wasn't that his body was weakening. It wasn't that his technique was declining. It was his mind that was exhausted. Borg later said there were times he stepped onto the court feeling almost empty. He still played. He still won, but a part of him seemed to have left the game long ago. To many people, Borg's retirement decision seemed like giving up. But to him, it was an act of survival. Borg understood that if he kept living in that cycle, he wouldn't just lose the joy of tennis. He could lose himself. And so, he did something very few legends in sports history dared to do. He walked off the stage while the lights were still shining. No grand farewell. No tearful final match. Just a quiet but firm decision. Bjorn Borg left professional tennis. To fans, it was a mystery. How could someone at the peak just walk away? How could a legend leave it all behind? But those who understood Borg knew he didn't leave because of weakness. He left because he had fought too long. In the world of sports, people often say victory is the only measure of greatness. But Borg's story shows a different truth. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't beating an opponent. Sometimes, the greatest victory is knowing when to leave the fight to save yourself. When Borg walked off the tennis court for the last time as a champion, the whole world thought his story was over. But in reality, the hardest chapter in Bjorn Borg's life had only just begun. And in the years that followed, the Ice King of Wimbledon would have to face an enemy more frightening than any opponent on court. The very void that glory left behind. After his decision to leave tennis in 1983, the world believed that Bjorn Borg could finally enjoy the life he had missed throughout his youth. No more endless seasons, no more pressure from Wimbledon, no more millions of eyes waiting for him to win. But reality turned out to be completely different. When the sound of the crowd's applause faded away, Borg had to face a void he had never prepared to confront. For more than 10 years, his entire life had had only one single goal: winning on the tennis court. Every morning, every flight, every training day had clear meaning, but when he left the courts, that goal suddenly vanished. And along with it, a part of his identity dissolved too. Borg had once been the man the whole world knew, but when he was no longer a competing player, he began asking himself a terrifying question. If he wasn't the Bjorn Borg of Wimbledon anymore, then who was he? The early days after retirement passed in a strange feeling. No more tournament schedules, no more intense training sessions, but that freedom quickly turned into emptiness. Borg had grown used to packed stadiums full of spectators, to the noise and adrenaline of top-level competition. Now, normal life felt far too quiet, and in that silence, the emotions he had locked away for so many years began to surge up. Borg started looking for other ways to fill that void. Parties appeared more and more in his life, late nights that stretched into morning, where loud music, flashing lights, and wine seemed to help him temporarily forget the sense of being lost. To many around him, Borg was still the tennis legend. He was still welcomed everywhere. But that admiration couldn't replace the sense of purpose tennis had once given him, and so alcohol began to become a familiar companion. Then the partying grew more extreme. In the world of sports and entertainment stars, drugs were not uncommon. Borg gradually got pulled into that whirlwind, not because he was seeking rebellion, but because he was trying to escape a deep emptiness. The man who once had perfect emotional control on the tennis court was now losing control in his personal life. People who had followed him since the Wimbledon days began to notice the change. Borg was no longer the cold, intensely focused figure from his playing years. He became more erratic, more easily swept into long nights of partying and impulsive decisions. The press started writing about his new lifestyle with a mix of curiosity and concern. To the public, it was hard to understand how a sports legend could go so astray, but for Borg, it was the consequence of too abrupt a transition. In elite sports, many athletes spend their entire youth building their identity around their career. When that career ends, they have to relearn how to live as a normal person. And that process can sometimes be more painful than any loss on the court. Borg had once stepped onto the court with near total control. But life after glory had no clear rules, no umpires, no scoreboards. Just long days passing by without him knowing where he was headed. Real friends remained rare. The people who appeared around him were often drawn more to his fame than to the real person he was. The parties could last all night, but when dawn came, Borg often faced the familiar loneliness again. And the irony was that the man who once made millions of spectators stand and applaud now felt lost in his own life. Those years were later called the dark years of Bjorn Borg by many, not because he lost everything. He still had money, fame, and admiration, but inside, he was fighting a crisis very few could see. The crisis of a person who had lived at the peak too early and now had to learn how to exist when the stage lights had gone out. The man who once dominated Wimbledon was now lost in a world without a tennis court to guide him, and in those years, Bjorn Borg began to understand that leaving tennis wasn't the final match of his life. It was only the start of another battle to find himself again. The years of being lost after leaving the courts didn't stop at emptiness. For Bjorn Borg, that void gradually became an abyss. If the earlier part of his life had been guided by discipline, schedules, and the pressure to win, this part drifted in aimless chaos. No more morning practices, no more sound of balls bouncing on grass, no more millions of spectators watching every shot. Instead, there were endless long nights in nightclubs in Monte Carlo, Stockholm, or New York. Lavish parties began to become the new routine in Borg's life. There, he was still welcomed as a legend. People around him still called him the Wimbledon champion, the Iceman who had stunned the whole world. But behind the smiles and raised champagne glasses was a different truth. Fame couldn't save him from himself. At first, alcohol was just a way to relax after years of intense competition. A glass in the evening, then another. But over time, those glasses became part of every gathering, every party, every long night. Alcohol helped Borg forget the feeling of being adrift for a few brief hours. But when the buzz wore off, the emptiness inside became even clearer. In the partying world of the 1980s, alcohol was rarely the only thing present. Borg began to come into contact with more dangerous things. Drugs crept into his life as a temporary escape from the void. For many in the upper class and entertainment circles of that time, this was almost normal. But for a person who had lived his entire youth in iron discipline, it was a slide he didn't even notice at first. The man who once had absolute emotional control on the court was now gradually losing control in his private life. People who had known Borg during his playing days began to notice the change. He was no longer the quiet but absolutely focused young man from the Wimbledon years. Instead, he was someone who was sometimes tired, sometimes erratic, sometimes lost in parties that lasted too long. The press started writing about Borg's partying lifestyle with curiosity mixed with concern. They still called him a legend, but behind the praising articles, questions began to appear. How could someone who had been so strong go so astray? The answer lay in his very greatness. Borg had lived too long in a world where everything was clear. You win or you lose. But life outside the tennis court wasn't that simple. There was no scoreboard to tell him where he stood. No specific opponent to fight, just long days passing by without him knowing what his goal was. Fame was still there. Money was still there. But meaning seemed to have disappeared, and it was that loss of direction that caused Borg to slide deeper into the darkness. The parties became more frequent. The sleepless nights grew longer. The mornings started later and heavier. Sometimes when he woke up in a strange hotel room, Borg would take a few seconds to remember which city he was in. To the outside world, he was still the tennis legend, but inside, he began to feel like he was drifting. The most painful part was the irony of the situation. Millions of people around the world still saw him as a symbol of mental strength. They remembered Borg as the man who almost never showed emotion on the court. But that very person was now fighting emotions he had buried for too long. The worries, the pressures, the wounds accumulated throughout his youth were no longer held back by tennis. They surged up all at once, and while the world still remembered the image of Wimbledon's Ice King, Bjorn Borg at that time was just a man trying to find a way out of his own darkness. The legend began to go astray, not because he was weak, but because even legends are human, and sometimes, after the stage lights go out, that human has to face shadows that no title can ever chase away. Those years immersed in partying and being lost eventually led Björn Borg to one night that many of his close ones later called the most terrifying moment of his life. It wasn't a loss on the tennis court. It wasn't a media scandal. It was a night when the line between life and death became so fragile that those around him believed they might lose him forever. The years after retirement had plunged Borg deep into a vortex of alcohol and endless partying. At first, it all just seemed like a way to escape the emptiness, but over time, that escape became a dangerous habit. In parties that stretched until dawn, alcohol was no longer enough to numb the racing thoughts in his head. Stronger things began to appear. Pills, stimulants, and Borg, the man who once controlled every emotion on the court with iron discipline, was now gradually swept along by a current he could no longer control. That night started like so many others. Loud music, flashing lights, laughter and glasses of wine constantly being refilled. Borg was still the center of attention, a sports legend everyone wanted to be near. But when the party wound down and the crowd thinned out, things began to change. The friends who stayed started noticing Borg wasn't responding normally. He grew quiet, tired, then gradually almost unconscious. At first, they thought it was just the result of one too long night of partying. But then fear began to spread. Borg wouldn't wake up. His breathing became weak and irregular. One friend tried to shake him awake. No response. Another called his name louder. Still no answer. In that moment, panic set in. Those present realized this was no longer a party. This could be a life-or-death situation. One of the friends hurriedly called emergency services. The minutes waiting for the ambulance felt endless. In that silent room, the man who once made the whole world stand and applaud now lay motionless, like a completely different person from the legend everyone had known. When the medical team arrived, They quickly recognized how serious the situation was. Borg had overdosed. If help had come even a little later, things could have ended in the most tragic way. That night, his friends stood outside the hospital in heavy silence. They didn't say much, but in every person's eyes was the same fear. Could the legend of Wimbledon slip away in a hospital room, not on the court, not in glory, but in the midst of his own lost path? News of the incident quickly spread through sports circles and the media. Many couldn't believe that Bjorn Borg, once seen as the symbol of discipline and control, could fall so low. But for Borg, that was the bottom of his life. When he woke up after that near-fatal crisis, he could no longer pretend everything was fine. He could no longer convince himself that the parties were just a way to unwind. For the first time in many years, he had to face a painful truth. He had gone too far. Throughout his tennis career, Borg had faced the most intense matches, the most dangerous opponents, the highest pressure moments in front of millions of spectators. But no match was like the one he was facing now, because this time his opponent wasn't across the net. It was inside him, and for the first time in many years, Björn Borg understood that if he didn't change, if he didn't find a way back, the legend of Wimbledon could disappear forever. Not because of a defeat on the court, but because he had lost the fight to hold on to his own life. The man who was once unbeatable on the tennis court was now fighting for the most basic thing, to keep living. After the night when his life was almost taken away, many thought Björn Borg had hit the absolute bottom of his life. But bigger challenges still waited ahead. If the previous years had been a mental crisis, the years that followed became a financial storm that shook his life in a completely different way. When Borg left tennis at 26 years old, he didn't just walk away from the courts with enormous fame, but also with a considerable fortune. The Grand Slam titles, endorsement deals, and global celebrity had earned him millions of dollars at his peak. For many, that money would have been enough to live comfortably for life. But Borg, like many young athletes who leave sports too early, believed life after tennis needed a new purpose. And that purpose became business. At first, the idea seemed perfectly reasonable. Borg invested in various projects, fashion, sportswear brands, real estate, and many other business plans. His name back then was still a powerful brand. Partners believed anything tied to the name Bjorn Borg could succeed. But business isn't like tennis. On the court, Borg could control everything: strategy, discipline, focus. In the business world, everything is far more complicated. Bad decisions, unreliable partners, and rapidly changing markets began to create cracks in his projects. Some early ventures looked promising, but many others quickly failed. Money started flowing out faster than it came in. Risky investments, lavish spending, and inexperienced decisions gradually weakened Borg's financial foundation. The man who once dominated Wimbledon now faced a completely different battle: the battle against red numbers on financial statements. By the late 1980s, the situation had become serious. Debts began to pile up. Businesses didn't deliver the expected profits. Some projects collapsed entirely. Borg had once been used to the press writing about his victories. Now headlines started talking about financial crisis. To the public, it was another shock. How could a sports legend with millions of dollars end up like this? But for Borg, it was the result of years of bad decisions and lack of experience in the harsh business world. The situation grew so bad that at one point he had to face a heartbreaking decision. Borg even considered selling off his most precious career, mementos, including his Wimbledon trophies. Those trophies weren't just metal. They were symbols of his youth, of legendary victories, of moments when the whole world stood and applauded him. The thought of selling them felt like selling off part of his own soul. Many of Borg's close ones later said it was one of the most painful moments for him. The man once seen as the king of Wimbledon's grass now had to consider giving up the symbols of his glory to pay debts. Fortunately, in the end, Borg didn't have to sell those trophies. but just having to consider it showed how far he had fallen. Bjorn Borg's life at this point seemed like a bitter paradox. The man who once had everything, fame, money, adoration, now faced the risk of losing it all. In the eyes of the world, he had once been the king of tennis, but in those years, he was like a man desperately trying to hold on to the last fragments of an empire that had crumbled to dust. And it was in that darkest moment that Borg began to understand a truth many legends learned the hardest way. Winning on the court doesn't guarantee winning in life. But even though his empire seemed to have collapsed, Bjorn Borg's story wasn't over yet. Because sometimes the darkest chapters of life are exactly where a person begins to find the path to rise again. After those years of financial crisis and collapsed business projects, Bjorn Borg gradually realized that the biggest problem in his life wasn't just money or fame. Debts could be paid off, business failures could be fixed, but something deeper was happening inside him, a crisis that no balance sheet could explain. It was an identity crisis. For nearly 2 decades, the world had known Borg by only one title: Wimbledon champion, the Ice King of tennis. From his teenage years, his life had revolved around tennis. Every morning he woke up with a clear goal: train to win. Every flight led to a tournament. Every round of applause confirmed he was the Bjorn Borg of Wimbledon. But when tennis disappeared from his life, that identity vanished too. And for the first time in many years, Borg began facing a question that terrified him. If I'm not the Bjorn Borg of Wimbledon, then who am I? It wasn't a simple question. For many great athletes, personal identity is tightly bound to their sports career. When that career ends too early, they have to rebuild themselves from scratch. But for Borg, that transition was especially difficult. He had reached the peak too soon, then left while still very young. Most of his adult life had never existed outside of tennis. In the years after retirement, Borg tried on different roles: businessman, celebrity, advertising icon, but none of them brought the clear sense of purpose he felt when standing on the court with a racket in his hand. Every time he was invited to a sports event, every time he appeared in public, Borg felt the irony of his life keenly. The audience still looked at him with admiration. They still called him a legend, but he knew the man they were honoring was a version from the past, a version he no longer was. This created a painful gap between his public image and his real self. On the outside, Borg remained a symbol of strength and calm. But inside, he felt like a man searching for himself in a dark room. Long days passed without him knowing what his goal was. No matches to prepare for. No opponents to defeat. No victories to chase. Just repeating thoughts in his head. Many people think money or fame determines a person's happiness. But Borg gradually realized that what matters most is the feeling of having meaning in life. And that was exactly what he had lost. Borg's close ones later said there were periods when he became unusually quiet. Not the tactical silence of an athlete before a match, but the silence of a person trying to understand who he is when everything that once defined his life has disappeared. That was the greatest crisis Borg ever faced. Not failure on the tennis court, not financial crisis, but the crisis of personal identity. Because when a person no longer knows who they are, every past victory seems distant. And it was in that difficult phase that Bjorn Borg began to understand that the biggest battle of his life wasn't against opponents across the net. It was finding the person he had lost on the journey to becoming a legend. After those years immersed in an identity crisis and mounting failures, Bjorn Borg finally reached a moment that many later called the quiet turning point in his life. There was no big match, no dramatic event in front of media cameras, just an ordinary morning when Borg looked back at his life and understood that if he kept living the way he had been, he would lose the rest of it. The years of partying, alcohol, and being lost had left too many scars, not just on his bank account, but in his very mind. Borg realized he could no longer keep escaping the emptiness inside him with fleeting pleasures. For the first time in many years, he began thinking seriously about rebuilding his life, not as a tennis legend, but as an ordinary person trying to stand up after failure. The first step was to distance himself from the lifestyle that had dragged him to the bottom. Borg gradually cut off the long parties, the aimless fun, the people who only appeared around him because of his fame. It wasn't easy. When someone has lived for many years in chaos, regaining discipline is like relearning to walk after an injury. But Borg had done it before, when he was a hot-tempered boy banned from playing at the tennis club. He had learned to control his emotions to continue on his path. This time he had to relearn control, but in life, not on the court. Borg began focusing on a new direction, serious and sustainable business. No more impulsive investments or unplanned projects. He started building something tied to who he really was, the Bjorn Borg brand. At first, the idea was very simple. Use his image and reputation to create a fashion and sportswear brand, carrying a dynamic, modern spirit connected to his tennis legacy. But this time, Borg didn't rush into everything. He learned from past mistakes. He listened to experts, built a team, and developed the brand step by step. Most importantly, for the first time in many years, Borg felt he had a clear goal again, not beating an opponent on the court, but building something that could last long-term. The Bjorn Borg brand gradually grew. From the first experimental products, it began to become a recognized sportswear fashion brand in Europe. It wasn't an instant explosive success, but a steady development, something Borg had never had in his chaotic business years before. And, more importantly, the process helped him reclaim a part of himself that had been lost. Every business decision, every step in the brand's growth, gave Borg the feeling that his life could still move forward. He was no longer just a legend of the past. He was building a new future. People who had worried about Borg during those dark years began to notice the change. He became calmer, more focused, and appeared less in meaningless parties. His life gradually regained the balance he had lost after leaving tennis. Not every problem disappeared. The scars of the past were still there, but Borg began to understand that life doesn't end when one chapter closes. Even when that chapter is his legendary tennis career, from the ashes of those failure-filled years, a new life was slowly taking shape. Not the life of the unbeatable Wimbledon king, but the life of a man who had fallen, had gotten lost, but finally found the way to stand up again. And it was that journey of rising again that was truly the hardest victory in Bjorn Borg's life. After beginning to rebuild his life from the ruins of the past, Bjorn Borg gradually found the peace he had lost for so many years. But life always has unexpected ways of bringing people back to old memories. And for Borg, it came from his own family, from the son who carries the Borg name, the name that once made the entire tennis world tremble. His son, Leo Borg, grew up in a completely different world from his father's childhood. Leo was born when Bjorn Borg's legend had already become history. For the new generation, Borg was no longer the player dominating Wimbledon, but a name mentioned in stories about the greatest tennis matches ever played. But for Leo, that name wasn't just history, it was family legacy. From a very young age, Leo saw the trophies, the photos, and the old videos of his father on the court. People around him often told him about the man known as the Iceman of tennis. And like many children growing up in a sports family, Leo gradually became drawn to the very sport that had made his father's name famous. Leo started playing tennis. At first, it was just a game, a joy like any child picking up a racket for the first time. But as he grew older, talent began to emerge. His strokes, his movement on the court, and even his demeanor during matches sometimes reminded people of his father. And when that happened, the media immediately took notice. Sports press started writing articles with familiar headlines. Bjorn Borg's son is following in the legend's footsteps. Videos of Leo on the court were shared across sports pages. Every match of his was compared to his father's matches from the past. To audiences, it was a captivating story. The tennis legend, and now the next generation carrying the same name stepping onto the court. But for Borg, that story carried a completely different emotion. He understood better than anyone the price of glory in tennis. He knew the feeling when an entire nation places expectations on a young man's shoulders. He knew the pressure when every match becomes a test in front of millions of eyes. And he knew the loneliness when a person has to live under the shadow of a legend, even when that legend is his own father. Borg once said in an interview that what worried him most wasn't whether Leo would win or not. What worried him was whether Leo would have to endure the same pressures he once did. When watching his son step onto the court, Borg didn't just see a young player. He saw himself from many years ago, the boy Bjorn Borg, stepping into a world he didn't fully understand. There were times Borg stood silently in the stands while Leo competed, not with the eyes of a coach, but with the eyes of a father hoping his son could enjoy tennis in the way he himself never could. Borg didn't want Leo to become a copy of himself. He didn't want his son to carry the enormous weight of the Borg name. He just wanted Leo to have the chance to live his own life, whether that life led him to the top of tennis or not. But in the world of sports, stories of father and son always carry a special allure. And every time Leo stepped onto the court, the media mentioned Bjorn Borg's name again. Comparisons. Expectations. Questions about whether Leo could become a legend like his father. Borg understood he couldn't stop it from happening. The Borg name had become part of tennis history, and anyone carrying that name who steps onto the court would be compared to the past. But what Borg hoped was that Leo wouldn't have to live in the cage he himself had once been trapped in. He hoped his son could play tennis for the joy of it, not because of the burden of history. And in those moments, Bjorn Borg realized his own journey had changed. He was no longer fighting to become a legend. He was no longer chasing titles. Now, what mattered most to him was protecting something he once didn't have: the freedom for a child to grow up without carrying the whole world on his shoulders. Because more than anyone, Borg understood that glory can turn a person into a legend. But the pressure of glory can also make a life profoundly lonely, and this time, he hoped his son's story would be different. The years of watching his son enter the world of tennis made Bjorn Borg realize that time had passed faster than he ever thought. The man who once stunned the world with 5 consecutive Wimbledon titles had now entered a different phase of life. As he approached 70 years old, Borg no longer lived in the chaotic pace of his fame-filled years, nor in the dark years of crisis. His life now slowed down. It became quieter and more reflective. Many years ago, Borg lived in a world where everything happened under stage lights. Cameras, audiences, media, and the pressure to win were always present. But in this phase of life, he began to find value in the small things he had barely had time to notice before. Quiet mornings, ordinary conversations, moments without cameras or applause. Borg's life no longer revolved around finals or intercontinental flights. He spent more time with family, with the now stable business, and with simple activities he had never had the chance to experience before. Many people say that the Borg of these years is completely different from the Borg the world once knew. The cold man who almost never showed emotion on the tennis court now became quiet in a different way. Not the silence of a warrior before a match, but the calm of a person looking back on his life. In the rare interviews he gave, Borg began talking more about his past mistakes, not with bitter regret, but with the understanding of someone who had gone through enough ups and downs to see everything more clearly. He spoke about the years of fame, when the whole world saw him as a winning machine. He spoke about the pressure he carried on his shoulders when he was too young. And he also spoke about the years that followed, when he got lost and had to learn to stand up from his own failures. Borg understood that his life wasn't a perfect story. It wasn't a continuous string of victories like the Wimbledon titles fans still remember. It was a journey full of mistakes, falls, and getting back up. There were afternoons when Borg sat alone and watched old matches again. The black and white images of center court, the heavy topspin shots, the moments when the crowd stood and applauded. To many people, those were immortal moments in sports history. But to Borg, they were also memories of a young man who lived too fast, too soon, and under too much pressure. He didn't deny his pride in those victories. But he also understood that fame isn't the whole of life. Fame comes and goes. Newspaper headlines change over time. New legends emerge, but what remains in the end isn't the trophies or the records. What remains is the person you become after everything. Borg once lived for many years in fear of failure. Then he lived for many years in fear of being lost. But in this phase of life, he began to understand that not everything needs to be controlled. Not every moment needs to be a victory. Perhaps that was the greatest lesson Bjorn Borg learned after all the ups and downs. That a person doesn't need to be a legend all the time. That sometimes the most important thing is learning how to live like an ordinary person. The man once called the Ice King of Wimbledon now spent many days in simple peace. No packed stands, no cheering crowds, just time, memories, and a calm that came slowly but truly. And in that quiet, Borg seemed to have finally found what he had been searching for all those years. Not glory, but reconciliation with his own life. The quiet years of old age finally brought Bjorn Borg to a place he had sought throughout his life but never truly reached: an understanding of himself. When looking back on a journey spanning more than half a century, Borg no longer saw his life as just a series of titles and records. He saw a far more complex story, a story of glory, of falls, and of the strength to rise after seeming to have lost everything. The world often remembers Borg through the immortal images of Wimbledon's grass, long blonde hair flowing in the wind, the white headband, and a face that almost never showed emotion. They remember the 5 consecutive Wimbledon titles. They remember the 6 Roland Garros titles. They remember the legendary matches against John McEnroe and Jimmy Connors, rivalries that became part of sports history. In the memory of millions of fans, Borg was always Ice Borg, the Iceman of tennis, a winning machine nearly unbreakable by pressure. But Borg's real story didn't end on the tennis court, and if people only look at the trophies, they miss the most important part of the legacy he left behind. Because Bjorn Borg isn't a legend just because he won. He is a legend because he survived the crushing pressure of fame that came too early, survived the loneliness of his peak years when the whole world saw him as an icon, but very few saw the real person behind it, survived the lost years after leaving tennis when his life slid into alcohol, parties, and bad decisions, and survived the financial failures, identity crises, and moments when even he wasn't sure he could get back up. Some sports legends end their careers in perfect glory. Borg did not. His story is more complicated, more painful, and therefore more human. When he left tennis at 26 years old, the world thought they had witnessed a legend disappear too soon. But in reality, the biggest battle of Bjorn Borg only began when he left the courts. Because that battle was no longer against opponents across the net. It was a battle with himself, a battle with the expectations the world placed on his shoulders, a battle with the emptiness after the stage lights went out, and a battle to find the real person behind the name Bjorn Borg. For many years, Borg thought he had to be the icon the world expected, the cold man, the emotionless man, the man who never fell. But time eventually taught him something else. No one can live forever in that armor. And sometimes true strength isn't in never falling. It's in getting up after you've fallen. When Borg watched his son, Leo Borg, step onto the tennis court, he understood the price of glory more clearly than ever. He no longer wanted his son to become a legend like himself. He only hoped Leo could play tennis with joy, something he himself had lost too early in life. And perhaps that was the clearest sign that Bjorn Borg had changed. The man who once lived under the pressure to win now understood that life isn't always a match. Some victories aren't recorded on a scoreboard. There are no crowds standing to applaud. No trophy is awarded. But they are still great victories. Victory when you overcome your own darkness. Victory when you learn to forgive your past mistakes. And victory when you find your true self again after years of being lost. When looking back on the entire story of Bjorn Borg, what makes him a legend isn't the statistics. It isn't the records. It isn't the Grand Slam titles. What makes him a legend is the journey of a man who went from absolute heights to the deepest lows of life and still found a way to keep walking forward. In sports history, many champions are remembered for the trophies they raised. But Bjorn Borg's legacy perhaps lies in something else. A quieter message, but a deeper one. Some champions are remembered for their trophies. Bjorn Borg will be remembered for surviving the silence after the world stopped cheering. When the final applause of Wimbledon faded into memory, when the stage lights had long gone out, Bjorn Borg's story still echoes, not as the story of a winning machine, but as the story of a man who fought with himself and finally learned how to live. Because behind the iceberg image the world once worshipped always existed a simpler but more painful truth. Behind that Iceman was always a heart full of wounds, a heart that endured pressure, loneliness, and failure, but kept beating. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Bjorn Borg, a legend not because he was perfect, but because he survived his own life. The story of Bjorn Borg inspires both admiration and a deep sense of sorrow. The world usually only remembers the image of Wimbledon's Ice King, the man who won 5 consecutive Wimbledon titles and 6 Roland Garros titles. An almost unimaginable achievement in tennis history. But when you look deeper into his journey, you see a sad truth. Behind those trophies was a person who had to grow up too soon and bear pressures that very few could endure. The boy who was once banned from his tennis club for being hot-tempered learned to lock his emotions away to survive, and that very discipline turned him into a legend. But it was also that ice layer that forced him to live in loneliness at the peak of fame. Borg's decision to walk away from tennis at 26 years old when the whole world was still singing his praises is clear proof that even the greatest champions have human limits. The years that followed, partying, identity crises, business failures so severe that he once considered selling his Wimbledon trophy show, that glory doesn't always protect a person from getting lost. But what makes Borg's story truly noble isn't the victories on the court, but the fact that he rose from those failures, stepped away from a destructive lifestyle, rebuilt his life with the Bjorn Borg brand, and learned how to live in peace. For American society, where success is often measured by fame and wins, this story is a profound reminder. A person's worth isn't just in the heights they reach, but in their ability to stand up after losing everything. Bjorn Borg doesn't just teach us about tennis. He teaches that the true strength of a champion is the ability to survive the silences when the whole world has stopped applauding. If the story of Bjorn Borg makes you reflect on the real cost of glory and the power of rising again after getting lost, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can explore more emotional journeys of sports legends together. Thank you for listening to today's story, and see you in the next video where we'll continue uncovering the stories behind the spotlight that the world rarely sees.